This week I'm giving a talk to a group in San Francisco about Merleau-Ponty's preface to the Phenomenology of Perception. And I wanted to provide a sketch of another important concept from Edmund Husserl's Phenomenology that Merleau-Ponty mentions on the first page of the book, and that's the word essence. The first thing Merleau-Ponty tells us is phenomenology is the study of essences. Now, broadly speaking, setting aside phenomenology for a minute, whenever we're seeking to understand the defining properties or attributes of something, whether it's a kind of material object like a chair or an idea like justice, we're asking what's its essential structure? What is it that makes it what it is? So essence, or essential structure, runs right through the history of philosophy, and it's not a focus that's unique to phenomenology. And that fact leads some contemporary scholars, like Daniel Zahavi in his introduction to Husserl's Phenomenology, to de-emphasize the importance of essences. In contrast, others, like Dermot Morin in his overview of the phenomenological tradition, like Merleau-Ponty, mentions essences right on his first page. And I'm going to follow Merleau-Ponty in spending time with essence here, particularly because I think the concept of essence, like intersubjectivity, which I'll get to in more depth in the future, I think essence is even more foreign to the culture today than it was in the 90s when I first read Phenomenology of Perception. So, since I'm rereading the preface together with a group, a few words about how I read, and then I'll jump into essence. One influence you might detect is the fact that part of my undergraduate education was at a great books school where an approach called close reading was taught. And one general principle I absorbed was that if we're talking about a great book, as a reader, I extend trust that the author knows what he or she means. So my working assumption is that any lack of clarity I may have about what's being expressed in a text, or what might look at first glance like a contradiction in the book, is not me suddenly detecting a flaw in a classic, but my not yet grasping the author's meaning. In other words, at least provisionally, I trust the author. And this attitude of trust is similar to the way that phenomenological psychology works when we interview people. So I read a text as a coherent narrative that's already intrinsically meaningful and hangs together. So again, any difficulties I may have are first and foremost my responsibility as the reader rather than the fault of the text. Now, this doesn't mean I need to agree with the author or assume that their argument is actually flawless or perfectly consistent, but rather my starting point is with a degree of humility in relation to the text. So even if one has strong reservations about phenomenology or any approach to philosophy or psychology, if one's going to engage, one needs to take an author's perspective seriously by temporarily setting aside one's biases long enough to get a sense of how the world looks through the eyes of the other person. So, Merleau-Ponty tells us that phenomenology is the study of essences. Essence. What's an essence? For essence, Husserl often uses an ancient Greek word, a word that appears in Plato's dialogues, ethos. By ethos, or essence, phenomenology doesn't mean something mystical. Remember, phenomenology is an approach to the study of consciousness. Essence refers to the meaningful structures of how objects are present for our consciousness. An essence is a structure by means of which we're able to grasp an infinite number of different actually or potentially existing entities as something. What do I mean? Well, for example, we're able to recognize any number of actually existing triangles, like an illustration of a triangle in a geometry book, or a triangular traffic sign, or a pizza slice, as triangles. Or we recognize 3 apples, or 3 people, or 3 hours, as all demonstrating threeness. Or at another level, we can have a common reference for justice if, for example, we're debating the justice or injustice of a Supreme Court decision. So triangle, threeness, and justice are all essential structures. The individual diagram of a triangle in the geometry book, or the traffic sign down the street, or the pizza slice I'm imagining eating, are not identical to the essence of triangle. Instead, they are real or imaginary objects that demonstrate triangularity. See? So as you're listening right now, whether or not you're literally in front of those objects I just mentioned, you're imagining them. And those imagined objects all demonstrate triangularity right now. For this reason, Morin and Cohen in the Husserl Dictionary define essence as an object of knowledge that's distinct from the individual entity given in perception. Let me repeat. An object of knowledge that's distinct from the individual entity given in perception. And if we reflect together carefully and methodically enough, we can take steps toward articulating the essential structure of something like triangle or threeness, or perhaps, with a lot of work, justice. At least we can take steps toward a description of the least variant essential structure of justice. So, does this mean that phenomenologically is Platonism? Is this just rehashed Plato? Well, essence or ethos is the same Greek word used by Plato for the forms. But phenomenology isn't Platonism. It's important to recognize that when Husserl uses ancient Greek terms, it's not because he thinks he's strictly duplicating the meaning that the terms had in antiquity. Just like Husserl's relationship to Descartes in the book Cartesian Meditations, another book that I'll be discussing with this group in San Francisco, Husserl sees himself as participating in a millennia-old philosophical conversation. He's seeking to work critically within that tradition, that conversation, and move it forward. So Husserl isn't talking about another world of ideas or essences that is separate from or more real than this world that we inhabit. And that is why Merleau-Ponty tells us in the preface that Husserl's phenomenology places essences back within existence. Meaning that essences is a way of recognizing and naming enduring structures of meaning that are already immanent in the ways our consciousness grasps the flow of daily life. Ordinarily, in what Husserl calls the natural attitude of everyday life, essences or essential meanings are lived without being reflected on or clarified. So check out my episode on the natural attitude for a deeper dive into the idea of natural attitude as a default way of being in the world. So, what's a real-life example of an essence or essential structure being taken for granted? When I'm facing somebody who's angry with me, a friend, a coworker, a partner, in order to recognize that they're angry, I don't need to pause to reflectively ask, what makes the way they're present to me recognizable as anger? Right? Much less, what's the essential structure of anger? Not necessary, right? The instance is already anger for me. That's why Husserl, in the first volume of the book called Ideas, wrote, the truth is that all human beings see essences and see them, so to speak, continuously. Right? So what he means is that essences are structures immanent in how we grasp this world as humans. We only thematize and name them as such when we leave a natural attitude and turn back to our experiences with a different attitude, a philosophical or a scientific one. You might say, okay, wait a minute, does all this talk about essences mean that phenomenology claims to produce final, perfect definitions of phenomena, like a chemical equation that captures and freezes the essence of the phenomenon perfectly and forever? In other words, do we arrive at a perfectly exact eidetic insight? Eidetic means about the ethos, about the essence of something. And the answer of phenomenology is no, not in every case. Because remember, we're not talking about natural science in which we might be able to isolate the two hydrogen molecules and one oxygen molecule that make up water. That works in the context of chemistry, but for something like three or threeness, we may reach a high level of exactness. But for human phenomena like anger, the essence is what Husserl calls a morphological essence. Morphological, from the Greek word for shape or appearance of something, morphe, meaning having to do with the shape or form of something. That is, we're describing a meaningful form that makes anger recognizable as anger. And in so doing, we were aiming to be as rigorous as possible, but not with the illusion that we're going to be able to once and for all exhaust everything that could ever be said about anger. However, we can arrive at a morphological description free of extraneous theorizing that captures the recognizable shape of the phenomenon in a penetrating way while remaining open to further refinement. And this is why clarifying essences is a scientific endeavor, according to Husserl, because it's an infinite series of partial steps toward greater and greater clarity. Now, I've been using the word we a lot while talking about essences. And that's because essences are intersubjective. Intersubjective is a term I'll unpack more fully in the future, but basically it means common and shared among a community of people who co-inhabit a world. Essences are intersubjective. They're not private or idiosyncratic. I'll give a geometric example. So presumably there was a first time in my life as a child when I recognized a circle as a circle. But it wasn't my version of circle. It wasn't just what a circle meant to me. It was circle for consciousness, not just mine, and not just a circle for English speakers or for modern people. Sure, I probably reached that realization in my own way, but the seeing of the essence was eidetic. My point is that if the essence of circle wasn't already intersubjective, then we wouldn't be able to recognize circularity, because your circle might be fundamentally different from mine, and there would be no such thing as circle as a shared meaning. So likewise, whatever opinions I have about what justice means to me, or the particular experiences of justice or injustice I've witnessed in my life, the fact that I'm able to name something as just or unjust, whether or not anyone agrees with my judgment in the particular case, means that we are already co-participating in the shared intentional structure of justice, even if we disagree on the precise meaning or the application of what just means in this instance. In other words, even if we have an intense disagreement about applying the word just or unjust to an event unfolding in front of us, justice as an essential meaning is present to us both. We share a horizon of meaning, and that's why our disagreement is meaningful. We're wrestling with a life world meaning that's there for both of us. This might be counterintuitive for some of you, because what I'm saying is the fact that we disagree means that we share something in common. Usually we think of sharing a meaning as implying agreement, but actually the fact that disagreements about justice are so intense and have such profound implications for the societies we live in is precisely because there is a shared essence there. And yes, debates about the interpretation of whether an event is an instance of justice or injustice, or by what criteria, is situated in history, language, culture, and much more, but that would get us into rich hermeneutic territory that's beyond the scope of this short discussion. And I'm leaving this out there as a teaser for a future episode about the interrelatedness of phenomenology and hermeneutics, since philosophical hermeneutics largely grows out of the soil of the phenomenological tradition. So, the last thing I wanted to share with you is some examples of the kinds of essential structures that the grad students I work with are seeking to identify through interviewing people and working phenomenologically with the transcripts of those interviews. In every case, doctoral students are seeking to identify an essential psychological structure of a phenomenon. So dissertation topics could include the experience of seeing oneself as an adult for the first time, or the experience of recognizing one is burned out at work, or the experience of seeing oneself as a good mother. These are all dissertation topics. In the study of religious experience or meditative experience, some examples of dissertation topics could be the experience of praying and feeling oneself answered by God, the experience of objectless consciousness in meditation, or the experience of the dropping off of a sense of a strictly bounded selfhood in meditative practice. So, as you can tell, none of these dissertations are aiming to have the last word in the essential psychological structure that they're aiming to discover. Instead, and I think this is fully in accord with a phenomenological vision of science, we're aiming to contribute to a growing body of knowledge about what makes an experience essentially what it is. Thanks for your time, and see you next time.